Let's begin our presentation. Uh, Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this panel. It's really great to discuss these matters. And thank you very much, Marlene, for the great talk before us. My name is Gabriela Kurtz, and I'm an advertising professor at the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And I also have a PhD in Information and Communication Studies at Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, the same state. My main research areas are game studies and gender studies.
And I'm Leonardo Kurtz. I'm a historian, graduated at the Pontifical Catholic University. This is actually my second tour, for I have participated in the conference that happened in 2018 in Copenhagen.
And just in case you're wondering, we are siblings, so this is why the last names are the same. And we are here to present our article called Heritage Monuments and Hidden Blades, an analysis of the historical construction and its relation to the production of Assassin's Creed 1 and 2. So the present article has as an objective to search for a relationship between the changes in the historical construction and the production of Assassin's Creed 1 and 2 games based on the concept of heritage. In order to achieve this objective, we conducted a qualitative data survey of the monuments and historical groups present in the games and analyzed the titles, credits, and interviews with the developers. So as for our theoretical background, we first started looking into historical game studies and simulation in history games. And we would like to start this background with the citation of Chapman in his book, Digital Games as History. The interesting thing about his quotation is not that people are not interested in history. People are often more invested in learning it when it overlaps with other interests, and among them can be digital video games. History as a point of view and not as a representation of reality kind of opposes to the traditional view on educational history. So as for the concept of historical game studies, we see that it is an intersection between digital games and history. So it is the study of games that in some way represent the past or relates to discourses about it. The potential applications of such games to different domains of activity and knowledge, and the practices, motivations, and interpretations of players of these games and other stakeholders involved in their production or consumption. It is perhaps because of this ancestry of sophisticated and nuanced work that historical game studies has also, for the most part, managed to avoid simplistic discussions about historical accuracy that have sometimes obtusely taken up much time elsewhere and often too little discernible benefit. Somewhat surprisingly, for a field concerned with a form dedicated to the active role of its audience, historical game studies has so far spent relatively little time examining the reactions, practices, and understandings of the players that actually utilize these games or the developers who produce them. The information about production is not so easy to achieve. We end up depending on what details are disclosed by the companies involved in the game design. This is a special participation of our cat. So we looked into previous researches on Assassin's Creed games, and Chapman, Folk, and Westing's findings are also noted by Julie Lavoyer in incursions with our research object. Also, we could see the relationship between the concept of cultural heritage and Assassin's Creed in Balel and Mundy. We would also like to point out a useful theory on how history is portrayed in games, which is the ludic aesthetics of historical description, which is the way in which they represent the past. That was somewhat present in Marlene's presentation too. There are two distinct categories of simulation styles, realist and conceptual. With those, we can understand the epistemological choices these entail. So, digital games can be understood as a composite form. They are not only constructed in relation to other histories, but also often borrow literally from the tropes and techniques of other forms. They often inherit those epistemological assumptions. They were never intended to describe only history produced in books. So we can see the conceptual simulation style, which is, for example, the Civilization series, tell us about the past without purporting to show it as it appeared. So they are less literal in terms of visual accuracy and often tend to show more explicitly the critical aspects of history. So they are not the focus on the present article, so that this is why we're not going to explore them further. And there is the realist simulation style, which is the category where Assassin's Creed is put by the author. It does not refer to historical accuracy. They can contain fantasy elements. They are realist because of the way in which they represent the past and the general claims that this involves. They generally work by aiming or claiming how it was, as it appeared to historical agents of time. It has a high degree of visual specificity. The reconstructionist approach gives the impression or the intent of impartiality, even though we are aware that history is never impartial, since they are portraits of a given point of view. However, the main intention is to give the feel of the real history, although this notion obviously can be discussed.
There's a special participation from my window here. It's quite windy today, but anyway. So the concepts of heritage and monuments are central for the proposed game analysis. Heritage can be understood as a space of value in which objects and cultural practices are understood as important elements of identity. The concept also implies that the objects inside this space of value must be preserved and transmitted. So throughout time, societies choose, exclude, include those objects. And monuments are the human-made structures that cause reminiscence. For example, the column of London, which sub-objective is to cause reminiscence about the London's fire. Of course, the reminiscence about those monuments can change throughout time, and monuments can even be destroyed, as we have seen quite presently. Now, what is the interaction between them? Well, heritage, since it's a space of value, it is capable of phagocytizing monuments, so it amplifies its valued space of what should be preserved and transmitted. And here are some examples for you guys to see how those monuments appear in the game, right? I'm basically going to cite them. I'm not going to work them through. In AC1, we have in the city of Acre, the Church of Maria of Jehoshaphat. Right, you guys can check it out. In the city of Damascus, in AC1, we have the Souk Sarouja, which is a commercial district in that city. As we can see, the monument itself is it's adapted to the gameplay. And in AC2, in the city of Florence, we have the Basilica di Santa Maria del Fiore, with this comparison between the real life imagery and the game design. And also an example of how in AC2, players can check out in historical information, usually about its foundation, who built it, and so on. Now, our methodology was based on a mixed quantitative and qualitative approach. So the quantitative step involved analyzing the Assassin's Creed's wiki. The website is made by fans for fans and aims to gather all that is possible about the franchise, including the list of monuments, historical groups, and so we counted all those related content to understand how many they were. And the qualitative step involved looking into interviews with the game developers that are available online, and there are quite a number of them. And also going through the title's credits, which was very laborious because those credits contains the names of the teams and the members as a whole. And sometimes the wiki didn't show everything that we wanted, so we had to check out the credits. Now, about the quantitative analysis here. Now, we understood that the monuments could be an interesting quantitative tool to comprehend the weight that history received in the game's environment. In both AC1 and 2, we see that the environments is mainly composed of cities, and there are 4 different cities in both games. Though a shift happens between the two games, not only in quantity, but also in how the inserted monuments are highlighted to the player. In the first title, we identified 27 monuments that, though they look environmentally important, like the Maria of Jehoshaphat, they are not explained to the player. They are mainly pieces of the historical place that intertwine with the gameplay. It's quite different from the second title, in which we have 56 monuments accompanied by a complex database of monuments, like the one I showed. General locations, people, factions, and events are shown in this database. It's also important to point out that from AC1 to AC2, there is an enormous increase in the team, from 150 to 450, located in 3 different studios: Montreal, Paris, and Singapore. Now, though we see an increase in the amount of historical information that is displayed, both games don't include an extensive historical research team, mainly maintaining a spin-off group of consultants that do not appear in the game credits. We can spot 1 historian in AC1's credits, but none in AC2's. So by adding more extensive historical corpus, the goal was to increase the believability of the historical climate, something that, of course, hasn't completely changed with the other titles. Now, this relation between more historical information equals history as an experience is a complicated way to construct a game that uses such context. So let's proceed to the discussion of those aspects. Now, since the information, the historical information, is promptly given with a controlled narrative, the historical content is mainly cosmetic, especially if we comprehend history as a critical study of the past in its many aspects. AC1 and 2 are as guilty of a cosmetic and inflated historical representation as are museums and tourist historical sites. It's more of a consequence of the way history is usually portrayed than an intentional action to turn history into simply heritage or historical inserted characters and places. This relates to how digital games can be understood as a composite form, as said by Chapman, since they are inserted in context and some tendencies simply do not fade when you transpose to another medium. Now, we believe there are 2 conditions that caused the developing team to proceed in such way. Now, first, the usually unbalanced relation between game design, programming, and historical precision. The 2 other usually win the context, and that answers how history is more of an accessory in those cases, those spin-off research teams. Second, we have the concept of patrimonialization by Katroga. That argues that contemporary society has been devaluating history and historians while it evaluates monuments and worldwide historical tourism, as if they had an intrinsic meaningful value as an historical experience. This can be understood as a general variable that affects our society. Now, things have changed quite a lot in terms of development when the historian Maxime Durand became the production coordinator and historical research. In Assassin's Creed 3 that was launched on 2012, all right, The game was set in the 18th century US, and Durand had just finished his master's degree on the subject. Durand's insertion was accompanied by the creation of an historical research team that would prepare the ground for new titles and also promote consultation. This shift was mainly caused by Ubisoft's ambition to amplify its historical background capabilities. We must remember that the AC series were giving a lot of money to Ubisoft, which we can see since the first and second titles, with each selling 8+ million copies and an increase in the developing team. Skipping a bit, 5 years later, Durand, the historical team, and the creative director John Goodson started to have educational ambitions since Assassin's Creed Origins in 2017. With that in mind, they created a spin-off of AC Origins, which was called the Discovery Tour, a game version focused on historical tourism and database explanations about different aspects of the game. Durand also argued that he noticed that teachers were trying to use the series as a way to approach history in the classrooms with their students. But those teachers had problems with gameplay and age restrictions.
Sorry, I was muted. So keeping that in mind, we have a discussion ahead of us because complete present created historical scenery as a means of education, though interesting, raises a great deal of problems related to imagery and representations that we will end up producing in students. Such has always been an issue since movies with historical background, but games offer a whole new level of interaction. The presence of historians as a full-time members of developing teams may produce better balance between design and historical precision in education-oriented games, especially to avoid the patrimonialization and the devaluation of historicism. As an example, we could see how Brazil, our country, was depicted in Assassin's Creed 3. The portrait was so problematic and stereotypical that they had to apologize to the Brazilian players. So of course, there are shady places and tons of inequality and poverty in Brazil, as there is in many third world countries. But there's so much more to it. Still, they choose this portrait. So why do they do that? So this situation and many others in the AC franchise says a lot about the ignored relevance of historians in the game. Even in games in general, the presence of historians may influence and increase in the value that society invests into history as a critical study of the past. So we thank you very much for listening through our presentation, and we are looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much.